Detroit, 1987. An 18-year-old high school senior with a promising future vanished without a trace. Her father, a respected man in the community, claimed she had run off in disgrace, a story the police quickly accepted. For 24 years, her mother lived with the monster who had created the lie, never knowing her daughter was imprisoned in a secret chamber just one floor below. Then, a neighbor's home renovation broke through a shared basement wall, exposing a secret that had been buried for a generation. Before I begin, thank you for watching. I'd love to know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It means a lot to know you're here, sharing these stories with me. We're in this together. In the Detroit of 1987, a city of fierce pride and slow, grinding decay, Aaliyah Monroe was a defiant act of hope. At 18, she was a high school senior on the cusp of escaping the gravitational pull of the neighborhood's low expectations. Her mind was a sharp, brilliant thing, and her ambition was a quiet, steady flame that the city's cold winds could not extinguish. While her classmates dreamed of graduation parties and summer jobs, Aaliyah dreamed of anatomy textbooks and clinical rotations. Her acceptance letter to the nursing program at Wayne State University wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a passport, a declaration of independence, a promise of a future she was determined to build for herself. Her world was a small, tightly wound universe, dominated by the two opposing forces that lived with her in their modest bungalow. Her mother, Renee, was a force of gentle, unwavering love. A woman who worked long, hard hours at a local bakery, her hands perpetually dusted with flour, her spirit one of quiet encouragement. She was Aaliyah's confidant, her ally, the soft place in a world that was often hard. The hard place was her father. Thomas Monroe was a man carved from granite, a foreman at the Ford River Rouge complex, a place of fire, steel, and unquestioned authority. He brought the rigid, hierarchical world of the factory home with him. His house was not a home, it was a tightly run ship, and he was its unquestioned captain. His rules were absolute, his expectations were rigid, and his love was a conditional, suffocating thing that was contingent on perfect, unquestioning obedience. He was a man who was respected in the neighborhood for his work ethic and his no-nonsense demeanor, but he was feared within the four walls of his own home. Aaliyah's ambition was, in her father's eyes, not a source of pride, but an act of rebellion. He saw her desire for a college education, for a life beyond the neighborhood, as a direct, personal rejection of him, of the world he had built and the values he held sacred. He had a different plan for her, a sensible job at a local clinic, a respectable marriage to a young man from their church, a life lived within the familiar, controllable orbit of his own. A woman's place is to support her family, not to go chasing wild ideas, he would say, his voice a low, rumbling threat that left no room for argument. But Aaliyah was not a girl who could be easily molded. She loved her mother with a fierce, protective loyalty, and she knew that her own escape was the only way to one day provide a better life for them both. The nursing program was not just a career path, it was a lifeline, and she was determined to grab hold of it, regardless of the storm it would create within her own home. She was a star, burning with a quiet, intense light, about to go supernova in a final, catastrophic act of defiance against the dark, controlling planet that was her father. The final confrontation was not a loud, dramatic explosion, but a quiet, brutally decisive act of war. It happened on a Tuesday evening in late May, the air thick with the scent of impending summer and the unbearable tension that had been building in the Monroe household for months. Aaliyah, her hands trembling but her voice steady, had placed her acceptance letter on the dinner table, next to her father's plate. It was the official letter from Wayne State, detailing her scholarship and, most importantly, her guaranteed spot in the university dormitories. Thomas Monroe read the letter in silence, his face a stony, unreadable mask. The only sound in the small kitchen was the nervous, rhythmic tapping of Renee's fingers on the vinyl tablecloth. When he was done, he folded the letter with a slow, deliberate precision, as if he were folding a flag at a funeral. "You will not be going," he said, his voice quiet, calm, and utterly final. He did not look at her. He looked at a spot on the wall just over her head. "Dad, I have to," Aaliyah said, her own voice a mixture of pleading and a new, unfamiliar steel. "This is my future. It's a full scholarship. I want to be a nurse. I want to help people. You will help people by staying here, by respecting your family, he said, his gaze still fixed on the wall. You will not be living in some dormitory, surrounded by people with no morals, no discipline. You will go to the community college, if you must go at all, and you will live in this house, under my roof, and under my rules. No, she said. The single word, a quiet, powerful declaration of independence that she had been waiting her entire life to say. I am 18 years old. I am going. I am going to live on campus. It's already decided. In that moment, something inside Thomas Monroe snapped. The carefully constructed facade of the stern, controlling, but ultimately rational patriarch crumbled, revealing the raw, narcissistic rage that had always lived just beneath the surface. His daughter, his possession, the one thing in his chaotic, disappointing life that he believed he could completely control, had defied him. She was leaving. He stood up, his large frame casting a long, menacing shadow across the room. He was not yelling. He was terrifyingly calm. I told you, he said, his voice a low, venomous whisper, that you will not leave this house. He moved with a speed and a purpose that was horrifying. Before Renee could scream, before Aaliyah could react, he had rounded the table and had grabbed his daughter by the arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. He began to drag her, not towards the front door, but towards the back of the house, towards the door that led to the basement. Renee's screams were a high, thin, and utterly useless sound. He was a man possessed by a singular, monstrous purpose. He dragged his daughter down the rickety wooden steps into the damp, musty-smelling darkness of the basement. Aaliyah fought. She kicked. She screamed, but she was no match for his brute, enraged strength. At the far end of the basement, behind a stack of old, forgotten furniture, was a section of the concrete wall that looked newer, cleaner than the rest. It was a section he had built himself years ago, telling his wife it was a secure storage room for his tools. It was a lie. It was a tomb. He pulled a hidden lever, and a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a small, dark, and utterly silent chamber. It was his ultimate expression of control, a secret place of absolute power that he had built for a purpose he may not have even consciously understood until this very moment. He threw his daughter into the darkness, the sound of her body hitting the concrete floor a sickening thud. He looked at her, his face a mask of triumphant, righteous fury. And then, he swung the heavy, sound-proofed door shut, the series of heavy, industrial bolts sliding home with a series of loud, definitive, and soul-shattering clicks. The final defiance had been met with a final, and absolute, act of possession. The immediate aftermath of Aaliyah's disappearance was a masterpiece of cruel, calculated deception. While his daughter was locked in a silent, dark tomb just one floor below, Thomas Monroe ascended the basement stairs, his face a carefully constructed mask of a man who had been pushed to his limit, a father whose heart had been broken by a daughter's ultimate betrayal. He found his wife, Renee, a crumpled, sobbing heap on the kitchen floor, her mind struggling to process the monstrous, impossible thing she had just witnessed. Thomas did not comfort her. He loomed over her, his voice a low, sorrowful, and utterly convincing performance of a jilted patriarch. "She's gone, Renee," he said, his tone laced with a perfect, theatrical sadness. "She packed a bag while we were arguing. She left. She said she was going off with that teacher of hers, the one she was always talking about, a man twice her age. She has brought shame on this family." The lie was as brilliant as it was monstrous. It was a story designed to prey on a community's worst assumptions, to twist a young woman's ambition into a sordid, back-alley scandal. And he had a prop. The next morning, after a long, sleepless night during which Renee had been in a state of near catatonic shock, he produced the final, devastating piece of his deception. He handed her a piece of paper, a single sheet torn from one of Aaliyah's own notebooks. On it, in a near-perfect forgery of his daughter's neat, careful handwriting, was a note. It was a cruel, self-loathing confession, full of false shame and a daughter's supposed regret for the pain she was causing. It spoke of a secret love, of a desire to be free from her strict family, of a new life she was starting somewhere far away. Renee stared at the note, her mind a maelstrom of confusion and a deep, primal, and unwavering disbelief. She knew her daughter's handwriting. This was close. It was terrifyingly close. But it was not hers. The loops were wrong. The pressure of the pen was too heavy. It was a perfect, soulless imitation of her daughter's voice. "This isn't her," she whispered, her own voice a raw, ragged thing. "She didn't write this. Thomas, what did you do? Where is our daughter?" His reaction was not anger. It was a performance of deep, wounded sadness. "Renee, I know this is hard to accept," he said, his voice catching with a perfect, false sob. "But you have to face the truth. Our little girl has made a terrible mistake. She has shamed us. All we can do now is try to hold our heads up and move on." He had created the perfect, closed loop of a lie. Any attempt by Renee to question the story would now be seen not as a mother's search for the truth, but as a woman in denial, unable to accept her own daughter's shameful, voluntary departure. Despite her own profound, gut-wrenching certainty that something was terribly wrong, Renee did what any desperate mother would do. She called the police. The case landed on the desk of Detective Michael Wallace, a man whose cynical worldview had been shaped by 2 decades of dealing with the city's domestic dramas. He arrived at the Monroe home to a scene that, to his experienced eye, was depressingly familiar. He saw a distraught, weeping mother, and he saw a stoic, heartbroken father. Thomas Monroe, the picture of a betrayed patriarch, calmly and sadly told him the story. He spoke of his daughter's rebelliousness, of her infatuation with an older man, of the terrible, shameful choice she had made. And then, he handed the detective the forged note. For Detective Wallace, the note was the final, definitive piece of the puzzle. It was a confession. It was a motive. It was a neat, tidy, and believable explanation for a young woman's sudden disappearance. He had a dozen other more violent, more pressing cases on his desk. Murders without a motive, robberies without a suspect. This case, as sad as it was for the family, was, in his professional assessment, already solved. He listened with a practiced, weary patience as Renee pleaded with him, as she insisted that the note was a fake, that her daughter would never do this. He saw not a credible witness, but a mother who was simply unable to accept the embarrassing truth. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a tired, bureaucratic monotone, "I understand this is a difficult time, but we have a handwritten note. Your daughter is a legal adult. There is no evidence of foul play here. We will file a missing persons report, but this appears to be an embarrassing, but ultimately voluntary, family matter." He had, with a few, dismissive, and professionally logical sentences, closed the book on Aaliyah Monroe. He had accepted the monster's lie as the gospel truth. The world Aaliyah woke to was a world without light, without sound, without time. The basement chamber was a perfect 6 by 9 foot rectangle of sensory deprivation, a place designed to systematically dismantle a human being. The air was cold, damp, and still, thick with the smell of wet concrete and a faint, chemical odor she couldn't identify. The darkness was absolute, a heavy, physical presence that pressed in on her from all sides. In the first few days, or what she thought were days, her mind was a chaotic storm of terror and disbelief. She screamed until her throat was raw, her cries swallowed by the thick, soundproofed walls of her tomb. She beat her fists against the unyielding concrete until her knuckles were bloody and bruised. She was a caged animal, fueled by a primal, desperate, and ultimately futile rage. Her captor, her own father, was a ghostly, terrifying presence. Once a day, a small steel panel at the bottom of the door would slide open, and a tray with a single, gray piece of bread and a plastic cup of water would be pushed inside. He never spoke. He never showed his face. His only communication was this silent, daily ritual of sustenance, an act that was a constant, powerful reminder of her absolute and total dependency on him for her own survival. This routine was the only thing that gave her a sense of the passage of time. One tray meant one day had passed, but the days themselves were a seamless, undifferentiated stretch of darkness. Her internal clock, deprived of the natural rhythms of light and dark, began to shatter. She would sleep for what felt like minutes, only to wake into a state of groggy exhaustion. She would stay awake for what felt like days, her mind a racing, paranoid machine. The sensory deprivation began to take a terrifying toll. The silence was so profound that the sound of her own heartbeat, the rush of blood in her own ears, became a deafening, roaring symphony. The darkness was so complete that her brain, starved of visual input, began to create its own. She would see swirling, phantasmagoric patterns of light, strange, ghostly apparitions that would flicker and dance at the edges of her non-existent vision. The outspoken, ambitious, and fiercely intelligent young woman who had been dragged down those stairs was being systematically erased. Her world, which had been so full of plans, of books, of people, of a future, had shrunk to the cold, hard reality of the concrete floor beneath her and the four unyielding walls that surrounded her. But in the heart of that terrified, disoriented, and systematically broken young woman, a small, stubborn, and incredibly resilient ember of the old Aaliyah refused to be extinguished. She was a fighter, she was a thinker, and she understood, with a dawning, pragmatic clarity, that if she surrendered her mind to the chaos, if she let the darkness and the silence consume her, she would die in this place. Her survival would not be a physical battle. It was a battle she had already lost. It would have to be a battle of the mind. Her body was a prisoner, but her intellect, her memories, her very sense of self, were a sovereign territory that she would have to defend with every last ounce of her will. The cage was designed to break her spirit. She, in the suffocating darkness, made a silent, solemn vow. She would not let it. She would endure, and she would remember everything. Thomas Monroe was a man who lived a life of perfect, monstrous, and unassailable hypocrisy. To the outside world, he was a tragic figure, a man who had suffered a double blow. He had not only lost his daughter, but he had lost her to a story of shame and public disgrace. He played the part of the grieving, betrayed father with a chilling, masterful perfection. He was a man of routine. He would leave for his job at the factory at the same time every morning, his face a grim, stoic mask that his neighbors and co-workers interpreted as the look of a man bearing an unbearable, private pain. He would return at the same time every evening, and the lights in his small bungalow would go on, a beacon of quiet, working-class stability in the fading light. He became a more active member of his church. He would sit in the same pew every Sunday, his head bowed in a performance of humble, prayerful sorrow. The pastor would sometimes offer a special prayer for him, for his wife, and for their lost daughter, asking for peace and for forgiveness. Thomas would accept the sympathetic handshakes and the sad, pitying glances of the other congregants with a quiet, dignified grace. He was a pillar of his community, a man who was enduring an unimaginable family tragedy with a strength and a faith that was an inspiration to all. This was the man the world saw, a man to be pitied, a man to be respected. The reality, the one that existed just one floor below the feet of his grieving, unsuspecting wife, was a secret that gave him a profound, intoxicating sense of power. He was the master of two worlds, the world of light, where he was the victim, and the world of darkness, where he was the god. His relationship with his wife, Renee, became a slow, quiet, and sadistic campaign of psychological torture. He knew she didn't believe his story. He could see it in her eyes, in the quiet, stubborn way she refused to pack up Aaliyah's room, in her insistence on holding the small, pathetic vigils on their daughter's birthday. And her disbelief was a source of constant, private satisfaction for him. It was a game, a silent, high-stakes battle of wills that he knew he was winning. He would use his lie as a weapon to control her, to deepen her isolation and her grief. "You have to let it go, Renee," he would say, his voice a soft, sorrowful caress. "You are only hurting yourself by clinging to this fantasy that she was taken. You have to accept the truth of what she did. It is the only way we can heal." He was the perfect, concerned husband, the man who was just trying to help his fragile, grieving wife move on. Every word was a lie. Every gesture was a performance, and every day, he would perform the most monstrous act of all. He would go down into the basement, to the hidden chamber, and he would deliver the meager meal that was keeping his daughter, the daughter his wife was grieving for, alive. The secret was his life's great, defining masterpiece. He had not just imprisoned his daughter, he had successfully imprisoned his wife in a cage of lies and public perception. He had erased Aaliyah from the world, and he had done it so perfectly that the world had not only believed his lie, but had offered him sympathy for it. The monster was not hiding in the shadows. He was sitting in the front pew of the church, a Bible in his lap, a quiet, tragic hero in his own monstrous and perfectly crafted drama. For Renee Monroe, the years after Aaliyah's disappearance were a long, slow walk through a living nightmare. She was a woman trapped in a prison of a different kind, a prison of unspoken truths, and a grief so profound and so lonely it was a constant, physical ache in her chest. She was living with a man she had once loved, a man who was the father of her child, and a man who she knew, with an absolute gut-wrenching certainty, was lying to her about the fate of their daughter. The forged note, the story of the teacher, the carefully constructed narrative of a daughter's shameful betrayal, it was all a lie. She knew it in her bones. She knew Aaliyah. She knew her daughter's fierce loyalty, her deep love, her unwavering ambition. The girl in her husband's story was a stranger, a grotesque, funhouse mirror distortion of the child she had raised. But she was trapped. What could she do? She had no proof. She had only her intuition, a mother's instinct, a thing that the world and the police had dismissed as the hysterical fantasy of a grieving woman. To accuse her own husband, a man so respected, so pitied in their community, would have been an act of social suicide. They would have called her crazy. They would have said her grief had broken her mind. And so, she lived a life of quiet, desperate, and very lonely rebellion. Her first act of defiance was Aaliyah's room. Thomas, in his performance of a father trying to move on, had suggested they pack it up, that they turn it into a guest room. Renee had refused. Her refusal was not loud or angry. It was a quiet, unshakable, and absolute no. The room became her sanctuary, a time capsule of a life that she refused to let be erased. She kept it exactly as Aaliyah had left it. The nursing school pamphlets on the desk, the books on the shelf, the scent of her daughter lingering, faintly, in the air. It was the one part of the house that felt true, the one part of the house where she could still feel her daughter's presence. Her second act of rebellion was her relentless, one-woman campaign to keep her daughter's memory alive. She knew the police had given up, that the world had accepted her husband's lie, so she became the sole keeper of the truth. She used her meager savings from the bakery to print flyers, the ones with the proud, hopeful face of her daughter on graduation day. She would post them herself, in the dead of night. A silent, lonely warrior, armed with a staple gun and an unbreakable faith. The vigils were her most public and most painful act of defiance. Every year, on Aaliyah's birthday, she would stand on the steps of their church, a single candle in her hand. The crowd dwindled with each passing year, from a supportive throng of neighbors in the first year to a small, pathetic handful of her closest friends by the 8th. She knew they came more out of pity for her than out of any real belief in her cause. They saw a woman who could not let go, who could not accept her daughter's shame. But she didn't care. The vigils were not for them. They were a message, a signal she was sending out into the universe, into the darkness, a quiet, unwavering promise to her lost child. I'm still here. I still believe in you. I will never, ever stop looking for you. It was a lonely war, fought against an enemy she lived with and a lie the whole world believed. The most insidious form of torture in Aaliyah's captivity was not the darkness or the silence or the hunger. It was the sound. The basement chamber was not a perfect, hermetically sealed void. It was a part of a living, breathing house in a living, breathing neighborhood. And the faint, muffled sounds of the outside world were a constant, agonizing reminder of the life she had lost. She could hear the rumble of the furnace kicking on in the winter, the distant, cheerful jingle of an ice cream truck in the summer. She could hear the sound of rain, the howl of the wind, the percussive, rattling thunder of a passing freight train. These sounds were her only calendar, her only connection to the turning of the seasons, to the rhythm of the world. But they were also a source of exquisite pain. Every sound was a ghost of a memory. The sound of children laughing on the street would transport her back to her own childhood, to a time of scraped knees and carefree afternoons. The sound of music, a faint, bass-heavy thrum from a passing car would remind her of dancing, of concerts, of a life that was once filled with joy and motion. The agony of proximity was the cruelest torture of all. Her prison was not in a remote, isolated cabin in the woods. It was in the heart of her own community, a cell hidden within the familiar, comforting geography of her own life. And from that cell, she could hear the sounds of her own family, of her own life, moving on without her. She would lie with her ear pressed to the cold concrete floor, the best conductor of sound, and she would listen. She could hear the heavy, familiar tread of her father's footsteps as he walked across the kitchen floor above. The sound, once a source of childish fear, was now the sound of her jailer, a constant, terrifying reminder of his presence, his power. The most unbearable moments were when she heard her mother. She would hear the faint, muffled sound of her mother's quiet sobbing, a sound that would usually come late at night when she thought her husband was asleep. The sound was a dagger in Aaliyah's heart, a shared grief that she was powerless to comfort. She would cry her own, silent tears in the darkness, a daughter mourning for her mother's pain. She heard the holidays. She would hear the faint, festive sound of Christmas music from the living room radio. She would hear the murmur of voices when her aunts and uncles would come for Thanksgiving dinner, their laughter a hollow, painful echo of a family life she was no longer a part of. She was a ghost in her own home, a silent, invisible presence at her own family's celebrations. One day, an event occurred that was a new and special kind of hell. She heard the sound of a crowd gathering outside. There was the sound of a preacher's impassioned voice over a crackling megaphone, the unified, powerful sound of people singing a hymn. She recognized the song. It was a hymn they sang at her mother's church. Her heart began to pound, a wild, frantic bird in the cage of her ribs. It was a vigil, a prayer vigil. For her, she scrambled to the part of her cell that was closest to the front of the house, and she pressed her ear to the wall. The voices were clearer now. She could hear her mother's friends. She could hear her pastor. And then she heard it. A voice that was as familiar to her as her own heartbeat, her mother's voice. Renee was speaking to the crowd, her voice amplified, strained with a grief that cut through the thick walls and straight into Aaliyah's soul. Aaliyah could not make out the words, but she could hear the love, the pain, the fierce, unshakable resolve. Her mother was out there. She was fighting for her. She had not believed the lie. A scream, a raw, primal, and desperate sound, built in Aaliyah's throat. She wanted to beat her fists against the wall, to make a sound so full of her own pain and love that it would shake the very foundations of the house. "I'm here! Mama, I'm right here! I'm alive!" But the scream died before it could be born, strangled by the memory of her father's one chilling threat. He had made it early in her captivity. He had told her that her silence was the only thing keeping her mother safe, that any attempt to make a sound would be a death sentence for the one person she loved most in the world. He had turned her love for her mother into the bars of her own cage. And so, as she listened to her mother's voice, a voice that was both a beacon of hope and a source of unbearable pain, she clamped her hand over her own mouth, her own sobs silent, racking shakes in the dark. The years passed, and the Aaliyah Monroe file settled into a deep, undisturbed slumber in the cold case archives of the Detroit Police Department. For Detective Michael Wallace, now a man in his late 50s, his face a permanent mask of weary resignation, the case was a ghost he rarely encountered. The city, in its relentless, brutal way, had provided a steady stream of new ghosts to replace the old ones. Every year or so, a small, insignificant event would briefly disturb the dust on the file. A local newspaper, on the anniversary of her disappearance, might run a small, sentimental piece about the mother who won't give up. Wallace would see the article, see the familiar, determined face of Renee Monroe, a woman who seemed to be aging in dog years, her grief a visible, physical weight. He would feel a brief, uncomfortable flicker of something that might have been professional regret. He would wonder, for a fleeting moment, if he could have done more. But then, he would push the thought away with the grim, practiced logic of his profession. He would pull up the original file, scan the initial report, and the old, familiar narrative would reassert itself. 18-year-old adult, a forged note. A plausible, if sad, story from the father. A domestic issue, a closed loop. The conclusion was still the same. She had run. The mother was just a woman in denial. It was a story he had seen 100 times. The system was designed to reinforce this kind of conclusion. A case without a body, without a crime scene, without a witness, was a case without a budget. It was a dead end, a drain on resources that were desperately needed for the active, solvable cases, the ones that had a chance of ending with an arrest and a conviction. The Aaliyah Monroe file was a statistical write-off, a ghost in a machine that was programmed to forget. Wallace's cynicism was not a personal failing. It was a professional survival mechanism. To care too much about the cold cases, the ones that were all question and no answer, was a direct path to burnout, to madness. He had to focus on the tangible, on the evidence he could hold in his hand, on the witnesses he could interview. He had to believe in the system, in the grim statistical probability that guided his every decision. But sometimes, late at night, when the squad room was quiet and the ghosts of his long career would come to visit, the Monroe case would whisper to him. He would remember the raw, absolute certainty in Renee Monroe's voice. He would remember her insistence that her daughter was not the kind of girl to run off, that something terrible had happened. He had dismissed it as a mother's grief. But what if it hadn't been? The thought was a dangerous one, a small, insidious crack in the thick, cynical armor he had built around himself. It was a crack he would quickly and consciously seal up. To question a decision he had made a decade ago, to open up that particular can of worms, would be to invite a kind of professional and personal chaos that he was simply not equipped to handle. It was easier to let the ghost sleep. It was easier to believe the lie. The file was a monument to a closed loop of logic. There was no evidence, so there could be no serious investigation. And without a serious investigation, there could be no evidence. It was a perfect, self-perpetuating cycle of official indifference. Wallace, a man who had once been a young, idealistic cop, had long ago made his peace with the flaws of the system he served. He had learned to live with the ghosts. He did not know that one of those ghosts was still alive, still breathing, still waiting. Just a few miles away, in a dark room behind a hidden wall, a living testament to a truth he had dismissed as a mother's fantasy. In the timeless, sensory-deprived void of her cell, Aaliyah Monroe discovered that the most powerful weapon against the encroaching madness was the discipline of her own mind. Her body was a prisoner. Her world had shrunk to a 6-by-9-foot box of darkness. But her intellect, the sharp, inquisitive, and methodical mind of a future nurse, remained her sovereign territory. Her survival depended on her ability to keep that mind sharp, focused, and engaged. And so, she transformed her prison into a classroom, a library, and a sanctuary. The catalyst was a discovery of almost miraculous significance. During one of her father's rare, careless moments, he had left behind a small, stubby pencil and a thin, spiral-bound notebook that he had been using to track his expenses. Aaliyah had found them in the darkness, her fingers brushing against them, a jolt of pure electric hope shooting through her. They were the most precious objects in the world. They were a voice. They were a record. They were a connection to the world of light and of reason. She hid them in a small, loose crack in the concrete floor, her secret treasure. And she began to write. Her journal became her lifeline, her sanity, her act of ultimate defiance. In the absolute darkness, her handwriting was a clumsy, sprawling scrawl. But the words were a testament to the clarity and the resilience of her mind. She began by keeping a record. She was a nurse in training, and she would chart the course of her own long sickness. She started with the date, or what she calculated the date to be. She created a calendar on the back page of the notebook, a series of small, neat marks, a desperate, disciplined attempt to hold on to the passage of time. And then she began to document. She recorded every visit from her father. She wrote down the time, the duration, the meager food he brought. She transcribed his rare, chilling words, his quiet, cruel pronouncements. Her journal was a meticulous, damning, and absolutely accurate piece of evidence. A witness statement that she was writing in real time. For a trial she was not sure would ever happen. But the journal was more than just a record of her captivity. It was a place where she could keep the other, more important parts of herself alive. She would spend what she thought were her waking hours writing down her memories, a conscious, deliberate act of defiance against the erasing effects of her imprisonment. She would write about her mother, describing her face, the sound of her laughter, the feeling of her hand. She would write down her childhood memories, the small, beautiful moments of a life that now felt like a distant, impossible dream. She was not just indulging in nostalgia. She was actively, strategically, refusing to let her father erase her past, and she would write about her future. She would fill pages with her dreams of being a nurse. She would write out the procedures she had learned in her high school anatomy class. She would design the layout of the small, clean apartment she had dreamed of one day sharing with her mother. The journal became her sanctuary, her best friend, her silent paper and graphite confidant. It was the one place where she could be free. It was the one place where she was still Aaliyah Monroe, the ambitious student, the loving daughter, the future nurse. Her mind, fueled by the act of writing, of remembering, of dreaming, remained sharp and clear. While her body grew weaker, her intellect grew stronger, honed by the daily, disciplined act of survival. She was a scholar in a dungeon, a historian in a tomb. Her father could chain her body. He could starve her of light and sound, but he could not touch the intricate, powerful, and beautifully complex world of her mind. And in that secret handwritten journal, she was not just surviving. She was bearing witness. She was creating the one, single, irrefutable piece of evidence that would, if it ever saw the light of day, be the key to her own liberation and to her captor's final and absolute damnation. The years bled into one another, and the world outside the Monroe house changed in ways that were both subtle and profound. The neighborhood, which had been a solid, working-class enclave in the 1980s, was now a patchwork of long-time residents, new immigrant families, and the slow, creeping decay of abandoned properties. The derelict, boarded-up house next door to the Monroes had been an eyesore for over a decade, a symbol of the neighborhood's slow decline. Then, in the spring of 2011, a symbol of hope appeared. A bright, colorful sold sign was hammered into the overgrown lawn. The house had been bought by the Hendersons, a young, optimistic couple with 2 small children and a shared dream of restoring the old, forgotten property to its former glory. The Hendersons were a breath of fresh air on the quiet, weary street. They were full of energy, of plans, of a kind of determined, hopeful belief in the future that the neighborhood had not seen in a long time. They were the pioneers of a new, potential chapter in the community's life. Their first and most ambitious project was a complete renovation of the crumbling, shared basement foundation. The plan was to dig it out, to waterproof it, to transform the damp, forgotten space into a new, warm and dry playroom for their children. They hired a local, no-nonsense contractor named Marco Diaz, a man known for his meticulous work and his fair prices. For Thomas Monroe, who was now retired from the factory, the sudden, noisy intrusion of new life next door was an annoyance. He would watch from his living room window as the Henderson family and Marco's construction crew went about their work, his face a mask of quiet, grumpy disapproval. He had grown so comfortable, so secure in the silent, unchanging world he had built around himself, that this sudden, chaotic burst of activity on his doorstep was an unwelcome disruption to his routine. He saw the construction not as a threat, but as a simple nuisance. The noise, the dust, the constant presence of strangers. It never once occurred to him, in his profound, unshakable arrogance, that the work being done just a few feet from his own basement, from his own secret, hidden chamber, could pose any risk to him. His secret was too old, too deep, too well kept. It was a part of the house's foundation, as solid and as unshakable as the concrete itself. He was a monster who had grown so comfortable in his darkness that he had forgotten that the world was still full of light, of new beginnings, of people who were determined to build things up, not just tear them down. For Aaliyah, in her silent, dark world, the construction was a terrifying, earth-shaking, and ultimately miraculous event. After 24 years of a silence that was broken only by the muffled, distant sounds of ordinary life, her world was suddenly filled with a new, powerful, and impossibly close sound. The sound of sledgehammers, of power drills, of the shouts of working men. The sound of demolition, the sound of change. The new neighbors were not just renovating a house, They were, unknowingly, about to tear down the walls of her prison. Thomas Monroe had grown old. The fierce, intimidating patriarch of 1987 had, by 2011, settled into the soft, paunchy complacency of a man in his late 60s. He was a retiree, a man who spent his days watching television, tending to his small, neat garden, and living a life of quiet, unremarkable, and monstrous routine. The passage of 24 years had been the ultimate confirmation of his own genius. He had committed the perfect crime. He had erased his own daughter from the world, and the world had not only allowed it but had offered him its sympathy. His secret was no longer a high-stakes, anxiety-inducing balancing act. It was a simple, mundane fact of his life, a part of his home's architecture, as unremarkable to him as the leaky faucet in the kitchen sink. His control over his daughter, the creature in the basement, was absolute. His visits were infrequent now, his cruelty a matter of lazy, ingrained habit. He no longer saw her as the defiant, ambitious girl who had challenged his authority. He saw her as a thing, an object, a problem he had solved so long ago that he had almost forgotten the details of the equation. His wife, Renee, was a ghost in their home, a woman who had been hollowed out by a grief he had so masterfully orchestrated. He had won his silent domestic war with her. She was a defeated enemy. Her quiet, sad vigils a pathetic, harmless reminder of his ultimate victory. This profound, all-consuming arrogance had made him blind. When the new neighbors, the Hendersons, had begun their loud, disruptive renovation, he had seen it only as a nuisance. The constant, percussive banging of hammers, the grinding roar of saws, the shouts of the construction crew, it was an unwelcome intrusion into his quiet, ordered world. But it was not a threat. He was so confident in the construction of his secret chamber, in its soundproofed walls, in the sheer, unshakable weight of the lie he had built around it, that the possibility of its discovery was a concept that was literally unthinkable to him. The secret was a part of him, a part of the house, as solid and as permanent as his own bones. He barely registered the work being done on the shared foundation wall. He would hear the sledgehammers, a dull, rhythmic thudding that would vibrate through his own floorboards, and he would simply turn up the volume on his television, a small, grumpy act of a man who was annoyed by his neighbors. The complacency of evil is a quiet, creeping thing. It is the slow, steady erosion of caution, the replacement of fear with a kind of lazy, self-satisfied contempt for the rest of the world. Thomas Monroe had gotten away with a monstrous, impossible crime for so long that he had come to believe he was invincible. He was a god in his own small, dark universe, a man who had successfully bent reality to his own twisted will. He had forgotten that the real world, the world of physics, of structural engineering, of nosy neighbors and diligent contractors, was still out there, just on the other side of the wall, and it was about to come crashing in. The work on the Hendersons' basement was a brutal, noisy, and thankless job. Marco Diaz, the contractor, was a man who believed in doing things the right way, and the foundation of the old, neglected house was a mess. His crew, a team of strong, hard-working men, spent days breaking up the old, cracked concrete floor and reinforcing the crumbling cinder-block walls. The shared wall between the Henderson and the Monroe properties was the biggest challenge. It was a thick, pre-war foundation, a solid wall of cinder block and mortar that had stood for the better part of a century. According to the original city blueprints, it was supposed to be a single, solid, structural wall. On a Tuesday morning, the crew began the noisy, dusty work of breaking through a section of that wall to install a new, modern drainage system. The lead man on the job, a young, powerful man named Hector, swung a 16-pound sledgehammer, its heavy head striking the wall with a deafening, percussive crack. He swung again and again, the rhythmic, brutal impacts echoing through the hollow, subterranean space. On the fourth swing, something unexpected happened. The sledgehammer broke through the cinder block with a sudden, jarring ease. But instead of revealing the dirt and rock of the earth behind the foundation, it punched through into an empty, hollow space. "Whoa!" Hector yelled, stumbling forward, the unexpected lack of resistance throwing him off balance. "Marco, you better come take a look at this." Marco Diaz came over, his face a mask of professional curiosity. He shone his powerful work light into the hole his man had just created. On the other side was not earth, but another, newer-looking wall of plaster, about 1.5 feet behind the one they had just broken through. There was a void between the two walls. "What the hell is this?" Marco muttered, more to himself than to his crew. "This ain't on the blueprints. It's a false wall, a hidden room." His first thought was a practical, structural one. This was a problem. A big one. An undocumented architectural feature like this could compromise the integrity of the entire foundation. His second thought was one of pure, unadulterated curiosity. He had been renovating old Detroit houses for 20 years. He had found all kinds of strange things behind walls, old newspapers, Prohibition-era liquor bottles, even a small, forgotten safe once. But he had never found a whole, secret room. He and his crew began to clear away the rubble, widening the hole, their conversation a low, excited murmur. The mystery had broken the monotony of their hard, physical labor. As they worked, a new sound began to filter through the hole they were creating. It was a faint, rhythmic, and deeply unsettling sound. Bang, bang, bang. It was a slow, weak, but deliberate and insistent sound. It was coming from the other side of the inner, plaster wall. It was the sound of something, or someone, hitting the wall from the inside. A sudden, cold silence fell over the construction crew. They all stopped what they were doing and just listened. Bang, bang, bang. It was not the sound of a trapped animal. It was not the sound of shifting pipes. It was the sound of a signal. The sound of a person. Marco Diaz felt a cold, prickling sensation on the back of his neck. The kind of gut feeling that a man learns to trust over a lifetime of working in the dark, forgotten corners of a city. He looked at the faces of his men, their own expressions a mixture of fear and a dawning, horrified comprehension. He didn't hesitate. He pulled out his cell phone, his own hands, the hands of a man who worked with heavy machinery all day, trembling slightly. He dialed 911. "Yeah, my name is Marco Diaz," he said to the dispatcher, his voice a low, urgent, and incredibly steady whisper. "I'm a contractor. I'm at a house on Elm Street. We just broke through a foundation wall into a hidden room, and I think there's someone trapped inside. You need to send someone, right now." The unwitting witness, the accidental hero, had just made the most important call of his life. The response was a study in controlled, escalating urgency. The initial 911 call was routed as a suspicious situation, a vague, low-priority dispatch. 2 uniformed officers were sent to the scene, their mood one of bored, professional skepticism. They arrived at the Hendersons' house to find Marco Diaz and his crew standing in the front yard, their faces pale, their work forgotten. Marco led the officers down into the basement and showed them the hole. As they stood there, in the dusty, half-demolished space, they heard it too. Bang, bang, bang. The sound was faint, weak, but undeniably human. The 2 officers exchanged a look, their skepticism instantly evaporating, replaced by a jolt of pure, professional adrenaline. This was not a false alarm. This was real. One of the officers got on his radio, his voice no longer bored, but tight, urgent, and clipped. "Dispatch, be advised, we have a confirmed situation at the Elm Street location. We have an unknown individual, possibly a captive, behind a sealed wall. We need backup, detectives, and EMS, on the double." The call went out, and the quiet, residential street was suddenly flooded with the flashing lights and the screaming sirens of a full-scale police response. The case, because of its connection to the old, cold file, was immediately kicked up to the desk of Deputy Chief Michael Wallace. He was at a meeting at headquarters, on the verge of his own retirement, when his secretary interrupted him, her face pale. He took the call, and as he listened to the details, the address on Elm Street, the hidden room, the sounds from inside, a cold, heavy dread, a feeling of a ghost from his distant past returning to claim a long overdue debt, settled over him. The Monroe case, the father, the note, the mother who would never give up. He drove to the scene himself, his mind a racing, chaotic maelstrom of memories and a dawning, horrifying sense of his own catastrophic, 24-year-old mistake. When he arrived, the scene was one of controlled, tactical chaos. The Monroe house was surrounded. The police, after a brief, tense standoff with a shocked and belligerent Thomas Monroe, had secured a warrant and had entered his home. Wallace went straight to the basement. It was a dark, cluttered space, filled with the accumulated junk of a lifetime. And at the far end, just as the contractor had described, was a section of the wall that was clearly, undeniably, a hidden door. It was a masterpiece of concealed construction, a secret that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. The tactical team used a battering ram on the door. The sound was a series of explosive, deafening booms that echoed through the small subterranean space. On the third hit, the heavy, soundproofed door splintered and broke open. A wave of cold, stale, and fetid air washed over them. The officers flooded into the small, dark chamber, their powerful flashlights cutting through the absolute, crushing blackness. And then they saw her. She was huddled in the far corner, on a thin, filthy mattress. A skeletal, almost feral creature who seemed to shrink from the sudden, violent intrusion of the light. Her hair was a matted gray tangle. Her skin was a pale, almost translucent white. Her eyes were two wide, dark pools of a terror so profound, so ancient, that it was a physical, palpable thing in the room. But clutched in her thin, frail hand, held like a sacred relic, was a worn, tattered notebook. It was Aaliyah Monroe. She was alive. A paramedic rushed in, a blanket in her hands. As she gently wrapped it around Aaliyah's frail shoulders, Aaliyah looked up, her gaze moving past the uniforms, past the guns, past the chaos, and she saw the face of Deputy Chief Wallace, a man she had never met, but a man who represented the world that had forgotten her. Her lips, dry and cracked, moved, and a sound, a dry, raspy, and almost inaudible whisper, emerged. "The journals," she breathed, her voice a ghost of a sound. "Read the journals." The truth had not just been exposed, it had been meticulously and heroically documented. The arrest of Thomas Monroe was a quiet, stunningly anticlimactic event. He was led from his home in handcuffs, his face a mask of sullen, impassive disbelief. The neighbors, who had gathered on their lawns, stared in a state of shocked, horrified silence. The man they had known for decades, the quiet, respectable, and pitied widower, was a monster. The lie that had been the foundation of their community's understanding of the Monroe family had been shattered in an instant. The reunion between mother and daughter was a moment of such profound, sacred, and heartbreaking power that it seemed to bring the entire chaotic hospital emergency room to a standstill. When Renee Monroe, her face a mess of tears, was led into the private room where Aaliyah was being treated, she saw a ghost, a frail, pale, and impossibly thin woman who was a stranger, a creature from a nightmare. But then she saw her eyes. In those wide, dark, and terrified eyes, she saw her daughter. She saw the same fierce, intelligent, and unbroken spirit that she had known and loved for her entire life. Renee collapsed at the bedside, her hand reaching out, her fingers tracing the unfamiliar, sharp angles of her daughter's face. The 24 years of lonely, desperate grief, of a hope that had been so cruelly and so constantly tested, came pouring out in a flood of silent, racking sobs. Aaliyah, her own eyes filling with tears, reached out a thin, trembling hand and touched her mother's face. Her voice, when she spoke, was a whisper, a sound that was just learning how to be a voice again. "You never believed him," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of a faith that had sustained her in the darkness for almost a quarter of a century. "Never," Renee choked out, her voice thick with tears. "Not for a minute." The story of Aaliyah Monroe's rescue became a national sensation, a horrifying and captivating tale of survival and a monstrous secret hidden in the heart of a family. But the most powerful part of the story was not the crime, but the evidence. Aaliyah's secret journals, the thin, spiral-bound notebooks that she had clutched in her hand when she was rescued, became the prosecution's Exhibit A. They were a meticulous, damning, and absolutely irrefutable record of her 24 years of captivity. The entries, written in the sprawling, clumsy handwriting of someone writing in the dark, were a day-by-day account of her father's monstrous crime. They were a nurse's chart of a long, dark sickness. And they were the most powerful witness statement the city of Detroit had ever seen. The journals told the whole story. They documented the lie about the teacher, the psychological torture, the slow, agonizing passage of the stolen years. They were a testament to a mind that had refused to be broken, to a spirit that had refused to be erased. Thomas Monroe's trial was a brief, sober affair. Faced with the irrefutable, handwritten evidence of his own daughter's journals, there was no defense. He was found guilty, a silent, pathetic, and utterly defeated old man who was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in a prison of a different and more public kind. The final scene of the story did not take place in a courtroom or a police precinct. It took place in a quiet, sunlit garden behind a small rehabilitation center. It was a scene of two women, a mother and a daughter, sitting together on a bench, learning how to be a family again. Aaliyah, her hair now cut short, her body slowly regaining its strength, was reading aloud. She was not reading from a book. She was reading from her own journals, her own voice giving sound to the words she had written in the silence. It was a story of unimaginable darkness. But it was also a story of incredible, unbreakable light, a story of a mother's faith, of a daughter's resilience, and of a truth that had, after 24 long and silent years, finally